everyone. Welcome to End of Life University podcast, where we share real talk about life and death. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wyatt. Thanks for joining me here today for episode number 329. I'll be sharing with you a conversation I had with William Peters, who's the founder of the Shared Crossing Project, and we'll be talking all about shared death experiences. I learned a lot from this conversation, and I think you will too, so stay tuned. I'll be starting it in just a minute or two. But I have one announcement that my online reading group, A Year of Reading Dangerously, which has been going on now, I think, for 5 years, is going to be happening once again in 2022. I just finished the book list for next year, and I will leave a link where you can either download the book list if you'd like to see what the books are, or you can also sign up to get emails once a month where I send out a reminder about each book that we are reading, if you'd like to be on the email list for that group as well. And also, William Peters' book, At Heaven's Door, is one of the books we'll be reading next year. So you'll be a little bit ahead of the game after this interview because you'll already know what that book is about. But join us in A Year of Reading Dangerously if you like to read, and especially if you like to read books about dying, death, grief, and the afterlife. Next, I just want to say thank you to my newest supporter on Patreon, Jennifer Blaylock. Thanks so much, Jennifer, for signing up and making a monthly contribution. I'll talk a little bit more about Patreon and how to join the team after this interview airs, so stay tuned for that. And now we'll move on to my conversation with William Peters. So here we go. Today, I'm so happy to welcome my guest, William Peters, who's a return guest on the podcast. I interviewed him over 5 years ago. And William is the founder of the Shared Crossing Project, whose mission is to raise awareness and educate people about the profound and healing experiences that are possible for the dying and their loved ones. William is recognized by many as the world's leading authority on the shared death experience, SDE, having developed research-based typologies that classify the full range of SDEs. William's book, entitled At Heaven's Door, What Shared Journeys to the Afterlife Teach About Dying Well and Living Better, will be published by Simon & Schuster for worldwide release in early 2022. And you can learn more about William's work at his website, which is sharedcrossing.com. William, welcome. It's so good to have a chance to talk to you again.
Thank you, Karen. Wonderful to be here. And it was when I heard you say, 2016, that doesn't feel that long ago. But when you think about what we've been through since then, that's a whole nother world. So Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'll say, well, I know you've been busy during these 5 years that we haven't been speaking because you've done so much additional research and you've written a book now. So I'm excited to get caught up on all of that. But I thought we should start maybe for listeners who haven't heard of you and your work before, maybe you could tell us a little bit again about your story and how you first began studying shared death experiences.
Yes. When I think about that, it's very clear to me that my 2 near-death experiences, one when I was 17, my first one, which was a high-speed skiing accident, a pretty classical NDE in the sense that I had a high impact accident, crushed my spine, and was catapulted out of my body. And I didn't really come to a sense of awareness of myself until I was looking back at my body, sailing away from the ski area, which was Squaw Valley and Lake Tahoe. And I was very comfortable. I was enjoying this perspective. Seeing the beauty of Lake Tahoe, the Sierra Nevadas. Then I got further away. I could see, San Francisco Bay, Colorado Rockies, continental North America, and then into this beautiful solar system. And my life was, going by me in snippets, like a panoramic life review. And all of a sudden, I am in a tunnel going towards a light, and I realized, oh, I'm dying. And I did not want to die. I was very clear that I had some sort of purpose that I had not achieved, and I pled with that light to return. And I did return. I kind of spun backwards, wondering, how am I going to make it back to my body on that ski area? I obviously did, but did not think of that experience for, I want to say, better part of 10 years. And I did have one, I think I was in my late 20s. I remember seeing a show on the near-death experience, and I realized, oh, I had that, but I still didn't do very much with it. It wasn't really in my culture. But I had another near-death experience that was quite different from the first. I had a blood disorder, idiopathic thrombocytopenia, and my platelets were crashing, ended up in the ICU. And next thing I know, I am above my body, floating, suspended, looking at life in the ICU. This is 10th floor of Kaiser Hospital, moving down the hallway. Once again, quite comfortable, very much at peace. Then the hematologist comes in and taps on me middle of the night and says, Mr. Peters. And I look down at my body, my eyes are closed. I see myself there and go, oh my gosh, that's me down there, but I seem to be up here. And then I have this question, what if I answer this doctor's question? And I was really wondering, do I want to go back in that body? And it was kind of an interesting moment. And I made the decision quite consciously, I will answer his question and see what happens. So I answered it, and it was like sand in an hourglass filling in. That's the way it felt, like my body was filling in energetically. Oh, another analogy would be like standing under a shower and feeling the hot water activate, energize, warm, and spread across one's body. It felt like that. And I answered him. And that was that. That was my second near-death experience. And from that, the teaching was that I am not my body, that whatever I call myself, I was very clear that I'm not dependent on my physical body. So those two experiences were really formative, although it didn't really, harvest any interest in SDEs, shared death experiences, at all for many years. It wasn't until I had an experience with my grandmother, and it was seeing her talk. She was dying, very close to death, within a few days, actually. And she was having an animated conversation one afternoon when I was at her bedside. And I was clearly not in her sphere, if you will. She was having this conversation, and it was clear that she was more in that realm where she was than with me. And I started taking notes on what she was talking about, because it was very clear who she was talking to, what they were talking about. And I later compared them to my uncle, who was the surviving elder at that time. And he told me that everything I was sharing happened about 50, 60 years ago. And it was true, some of the things. He was just bringing up some kind of unfinished business, if you will. So with that experience and a few others, I got very interested in end of life and started working at Zen Hospice in San Francisco. And at Zen Hospice, I started having these experiences where I'm at a bedside, and essentially the first one I'll share, which was quite formative, was with Ron, changed his name. And I'm reading him a story. In fact, it's a Jack London story. Ron was a merchant marine and loved adventure stories. So I frequently read these stories to him. And most of the time he was unresponsive. And he had been that way for a couple of weeks, actually. So on this occasion, I'm reading to him, and suddenly I find myself above my body, suspended, and I'm with Ron, and I look at Ron, and I'm rather stunned. Ron, on the other hand, is quite comfortable, smiling at me as if to say, check this out, and saying, this is kind of where I've been hanging out, and I'm like, wow. Some time later, I'm back in my body. I don't even know if I stopped reading. I don't even know the relationship between that space I was with Ron and the human realm that most of us hang out in currently. But that experience got to me, and it really made me, it reminded me of my NDE. So I had no doubt about where I was and what it meant. And so I was comfortable with it. And I started exploring these experiences, although there was not much out on it. It wasn't until much later, 2009, I heard Raymond Moody give a talk, and it was on the shared death experience. And as Raymond defined it, and he is the one who really coined the term for this shared death experience, the definition being a caregiver, loved one, bystander expresses that they're with somebody who's dying, and they share in this transition into a benevolent afterlife. And this is very similar to the NDE and phenomena. I think Raymond and I and others who study this would say there is no, they're identical in terms of the phenomena that are possible. Every NDE, every SDE is the same. Is different and very unique. But the possibility of phenomena seem to be, if you will, equal in each one. So that's it. And then I at that point, I talked to Raymond and I said, not only do I know what you're talking about, I've had many of these experiences from my time in Zen Hospice, but I think I actually, and this was kind of brazen to me when I look back on it, but it came so naturally to me. I think I know how to help people have these if they want them, because there's such a wonderful experience to share in the transition with a loved one and see the beautiful realms of the afterlife, if you will, and to see the deceased relatives and to experience this dimension that's filled with the best feelings and sensations I've ever known. And that's that's certainly in the literature from the near-death experience. And we have found that in our research as well. So with that, I started the research project, the Shared Crossing Research Institute. And now we are 8 years into it. And just, I think we have, I've really identified a number of typologies for shared death experience, which build on what Raymond found foundationally. But now I think we have just more data allows us to see this in more detail.
It's so fascinating. And you share so many stories in your book about different types of shared death experiences. And I know you emphasize that each one is unique, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the common threads that you have seen in these experiences. Like, are there any themes that seem to run through most of them?
Yeah. So there's a basic, I won't call it a typology. When Raymond was doing his research, he was really focused on, because that's what he saw in his research, was that most of these were bedside. In fact, he doesn't even, he said there's another experience I should just give a little bit of background for the literature before I tell you what we see. Raymond was really wonderful with defining the key elements of bedside SDEs. But then there's another researcher in Great Britain, Dr. Peter Fenwick, and his wife, Elizabeth Fenwick, and they came out with a wonderful book as well, The Art of Dying. And he had an experience called a deathbed coincidence. And it's very similar to the SDE, but it's a remote SDE. It does not happen at bedside. So I started studying all of these experiences, and we had a large breadth of research participants, now over 250 in-depth interviews. And I believe that what Dr. Peter Fenwick was addressing, and what Raymond was talking about, the shared death experience, they're all on the continuum of different types of shared death experience. So about 1/3 are bedside. That means somebody's at the bedside of someone dying, or they're in the room. And about 2/3 are remote. And that means distance does not matter. It can be down the hall. And if you're living in a house together, It can be across town. It can be across country. It can be on the other side of the world. Time and space do not matter. And then in terms of other, what we call subtypes, these can take place immediately at the time of death, but we have about 14% that happen after the death. And that means an hour, 2 hours, as much as a day later. And sometimes we even had them, a day or two later. And there is a pattern that I'll talk about that allows us to say, oh, that's an SDE because it looks a certain way. I'll talk a little bit more about that. We also have about 6% that happen before death. And those are usually a few hours as well. So it really challenges or illuminates this idea of death as a set time and space when, heart stops, brain waves cease. It really opens the aperture as to how we can look at human death. And I think that really provides for a lot more possibilities. And I find it to be really positive that there's a lot of transitioning, apparently moving from this dimension to what lies beyond. And it happens both before death and when I say death, kind of the medical determination of death, and after. And then the other piece is we also have another subtype is multi-person. So more than one person can have an SDE around one death. And we find that this can also be one person at bedside and one person remotely, or two people remotely, and their experiences can be similar. Typically it's some similar elements, but most of the time they're different in terms of the phenomena. So if we look at the key phenomena, the number one phenomenon we see in 51% of our cases is that the experiencer reports seeing the deceased, seeing the person transitioning, the dying, 51% of the time. And it's usually that they just witness them making this journey. The dominant motif in a shared death experience is a journey. It's a journey from this life to what lies beyond. And it doesn't mean it's a final destination. Most people will say that they saw part of the initial journey and that they see them continuing on. So there's no, like you see them landing somewhere. No, you see them moving, and it is in movement to the light. So if 51% of the time they see the deceased, there's also another, I think it's about 15% of the time you would see an elevated being, as we call it, a disincarnate spirit being that tends to be either a guide or somebody there to help with the transition. And people find their presence extremely comfortable. And then we also see the appearance of other deceased relatives. So, if your mother is dying, or you may see her mother, your grandmother, or a cousin, or an aunt or uncle, something like that. So you often see other deceased relatives there meeting. And that's only about 8% of the time, but it's significant. So, and it's not exclusive. So you can see the dying, you can see a deceased relative, and you can see an elevated being. That doesn't happen very much, but we've seen it. So I think those would be the most common features. But there's also light that happens quite a bit, and then you see a movement towards the light. There's also this one thing we found so fascinating, a profound sense of knowing. Like people just have this sense that realm they're in, they have a lot more information about the purpose and meaning of a human life. And they find that very encouraging, especially as they look at human life from that dimension, that they see there's kind of an understanding for perhaps suffering or trials and tribulations. And that's very encouraging to them. So yeah, those are some of the main elements. I think that's the start. There's a lot more, but I think the important thing to understand is that the SDE is almost identical in possibility as the NDE. So if you're trying to say, well, how would I study more about the SDE? The NDE features are very helpful. There's slight differences, of course, But, and I think that's what we try to point out in my book, is that we do a bit of compare and contrast, not a whole lot, but you really get the features, because we do have 28 cases and we go into them in quite detail, and we try and point out each case has a few of these features in it so that they bring them to light.
And so, William, are SDEs primarily positive? Do you ever see anyone who has a negative experience as an SDE?
Great question, and one that we wonder about ourselves. In the examples, like I said, we're up to about 250 deeply analyzed stories or accounts, and I don't think I can think of 3, and that is it. And in each of those cases, the stress, the distress that might be make it, lead it to be a negative or not positive as SDE, would be a misunderstanding about the experience. And so when we work with them, and I should say in our research, we have 250. In my clinical practice as a psychotherapist, I have had some of these as well. And it's a misunderstanding about what they saw and their interpretation of it. But once they realize these are normal, and that, for example, I'm now remembering one from my clinical practice where a man was witness to his wife being confused a bit in the afterlife. And he thought, for some reason, he interpreted it that she was stuck or overwhelmed. And what really was going on was she was, as we worked through it, that she was just confused, but that there was light around her and that there were other beings coming. And he could see that, but he didn't know what their role was. And he was a little scared about what these other beings were doing there. And I said, those beings, based on our research, are there to help. They're coming to help. Did you get any sense that they were not positive? And he looked, he goes, no. He says, in fact, she seemed to recognize them, and she had a sense of like this was okay, but I didn't know for sure. So it's really a lack of information about what can transpire in this transition. And once again, this is why I thank you, Karen, for doing this interview, because I think all of us who work in end of life, should know about these experiences, because they're, like I said, it's only a very small percentage that are the least bit anything but positive, and with some reinterpretation of it and some assistance from people knowledgeable about SDEs, then that typically goes away.
And I did learn from your book, William, that many of the people whose stories you've gathered have been carrying them for a while because they didn't feel comfortable or safe telling them to other people. And they were so grateful that they finally had a place to go where they could actually talk about what happened. So it feels like maybe we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. Maybe we have no idea how many people out there are having these experiences but have never told anyone.
I think you are spot on. I can only say that when I have gone to give a talk pretty much anywhere, people will almost sheepishly come up to me and say, I've had this. Now, if I'm at a conference like where Karen, you and I met at an afterlife conference, well, then people are, running up to the stage to say, I've had one, I wanted to share it, da, da, da. But a lot of times people will, when they hear about me in this work, and when they reach out to us, even in the research, they are cautiously hopeful that somebody will be receptive, that we will understand their experience. So, and we often have our experiencers who we interview will tell us that their previous experiences in talking about this, of which they'll say this is usually it's less than a handful of times they've mentioned it to anybody. And when they have, oftentimes it's been met with, what we say, discounting, or maybe a little dismissive, or sometimes disparaging, not often that way, but certainly not the affirmation that they were looking for such a sensitive, deep event. Many will say the deepest spiritual experience they've ever had. So, we're hoping to, and that is the goal of the research, is to normalize these and get information out about them so that there's a knowledge base in our field for this.
And I want to talk about this for the sake of listeners out there who might be wondering who is likely to have an SDE, because are they people who already believe that there's an afterlife, so they're already primed to be able to experience this? And I already know the answer to this question because I read your book, but I wanted you to talk about it for our listeners who might be wondering that.
Like you're asking who's most likely the candidates, if you will.
Yeah. And is it necessary that they already believe in an afterlife in order to have this experience?
Yes. So what we found is that pretty much anyone can have a shared death experience. And we have also found that people who are open-minded in a certain way, that helps. If there's a sense of peace or at least acceptance to the death of their loved one, that helps as well. I guess if you're not that way, there can be some emotional distress that can lead to perhaps an energetic friction, if you will, because I think what's happening here, if I may go into this just 1 second, it seems like these are highly energetic events. I mean, that's what people talk about. They never felt so much energy. Their body was alive. Felt energy coursing. Their body was humming. So it seems like to the extent that you can be relaxed and at peace with that you open yourself to receive what I'm going to hypothesize is the connection that's coming from the departing, from the dying. There's some sort of connection that happens across the veil, if you will. And it does help not to be distracted, to be as calm as you can be. So to that extent, while we do see that a lot of our people in our interviews had mindfulness practices or prayer practices, that is by no means the majority of the people. That's, I'd say, some 10 to 20%. That certainly helps. And they attribute it to it. And they even say that they had these experiences sometimes while they were meditating or praying or just afterwards, or they were sitting vigil, at the bedside or remotely during the SDE, and it happened in that space. But here's another key, is that we have found some people are driving or in the passenger seat, even better yet, and they will have this experience. Another one is shopping. We have one case we highlight. We have many examples, but one we highlight in the book where Allison is her name, and she's shopping at an outlet, and she says she's literally going through the aisles buying outfits for a business trip that's coming up for her. And she's doing it for 45 minutes. And she says later, as she's walking out to the car, she said during this time, she was being visited by one of her best friends who was dying in England. And she was here in Central California. And she says, I was just doing my shopping and this experience was happening the whole time. I kept shopping, but I could see her speaking to me. She told me she had to go. She was in too much pain. She thanked me. I had a live review with her and she departed. And so we call these flow states where the mind is at peace, it's flowing, it's engaged in some activity that is either habitual or repetitive. There's no strain in doing it. It can even be comforting and soothing. So that's another state. And the last one we really talk about is sleep states. A good many of these happen during sleep, probably as many, certainly these would be for remotes, about, I'd say anywhere between 15 and 20, 25%. We haven't really tested that out, but I have a ballpark on that, where the person is sleeping and it's a dream. It happens, and they may begin by telling us that I had a dream. But when we push back on them a little bit and say, well, was it a dream or was it a vision or visitation while you were sleeping? And they tend to say, oh yeah, it wasn't a typical dream at all. It was more real than real. And it was like a vision or it was a visitation. And it was a visitation often from the dying, or they break into a scene where they're visualizing their departing loved one, moving along this path, heading towards the light in a beautiful realm. So yeah, I hope that's who tends to have them, from what we can tell. And it's something we are fascinated by because I developed some methods early on to see if we couldn't facilitate this. And a lot of what we're learning is that the methods, which are to, certainly address any unfinished business you have with somebody, because if you have unfinished business, that's going to create some friction in the relationship. And we found that having a peaceful, harmonious relationship works really well. So that sense of heart opening with the dying tends to be a positive coefficient, if you will. And so our training focuses on cleaning up, addressing any unfinished business, and really getting people to talk openly and honestly about death and dying, and not just, generically talking about the fact that one of them is going to be dying, and to really talk about what that means and to prepare for it. And we find that helps our participants quite well.
That's really interesting, because just listening to this and listening to these stories, I could imagine that a lot of us would think, I would like that to be me someday. I would like to be able to participate in this. So the idea that we could be motivated to work on some things that might move us in the direction of someday being able to have a shared crossing, I think that's a good incentive, at least, for us to start working on ourselves and our relationships. But I was wondering too about the people who have had SDEs. Do you see that they benefit from it? They are transformed in a way after that experience?
Yes. So the primary benefits or after effects that a shared death experiencer reports is a sense that their departing loved one is alive and well in a benevolent afterlife. And that tends to be the language that they use in terms of afterlife, alive and well. They also report that they feel strongly that they're going to see them again. They don't exactly say where, but they have a sense that this relationship will continue somehow. Sometimes that's delivered by the dying, by the person transitioning, that says something like, live your life fully, I'll see you again when your time comes. And so for them, what they get is this sense of, oh, I will see this person, my loved one, again at a later date. And they take that as a knowing, as a truth. The other impact that we see is that any fear of death is ameliorated, if not alleviated completely. So a comfort and ease with death emerges as a result, because what they've observed is so wonderful, quite frankly. They also report a sense of understanding life in a different way. And with that is a sense that they have a renewed sense of purpose and meaning in their life, and they tend to make big changes. And if you talk about, the term you used was, what type of transformation do you see? We see people transforming their life in very real terms. They may change their profession. They may, communicate with loved ones in different ways that may sometimes result in the end of a relationship, and also may mean in embarking in new relationships. We also see a transformation around spirituality. People will often use the term that I'm more spiritual. I feel that I'm spiritual, not religious. So a lot of people can have these that come from a religious tradition. They still may be practicing that religious tradition, but they see themselves as more spiritual within that. And then the other benefit is grief. And this is so affirming as a therapist who works in end-of-life grief and bereavement. This was the piece that was profound to me, is that people's grief, it doesn't go away. You always feel the pain and loss of a departed loved one, but they have a context, a greater loving context to hold the loss in. So they will grieve differently, and their reconciliation of that grief will be much different and be imbued with a great deal of meaning. So they'll say things like, I know I miss my loved one, but I now understand it was his or her time. And I know I have to do my work here, and then we'll reunite at a later date. And they also say, but I also still have a relationship with them. And this is a whole nother piece that's part of our research. This idea that we're seeing is that these experiences lend themselves to other forms of after-death communication, which we call post-death communications, and they're meaningful. So a relationship, evolves and changes. It's different, but they continue to have a relationship of some sort, and it's meaningful for them, and it's of their own making. So yeah, there you go. That's a lot of the benefits and transformation that we see.
So it's such a powerful gift for people to have this experience. I was really touched in reading some of the stories in the book when people talked about this sense of unconditional love that they came away with, and knowing that that's real. And I think I wrote this down because I really liked it. One woman said, I had the answers to everything while I was in this experience. And I loved that, because I think one thing that plagues us, of course, constantly in our human minds is the unknown and the uncertain, and that we don't have answers for very many things. But the thought that there's a place where you can be in your higher consciousness and see the answers, and it all makes sense, even if we can't always bring the answers back to life with us, but to know that it's possible to look at life in a different way.
Thank you for bringing that up, Karen, because that's something that when these experiencers are in their experience, they'll say everything makes sense, and I was like, any question I had was answered for me, and I knew, kind of everything about the universe and human life, and any question I had would be answered. So yes, that sense of knowing is profound for people. And I should say, some will say that they're disappointed that they lost that and they missed that, and they're looking forward to that experience, having that experience again.
And I would say these stories are so comforting. And I think especially with what we've been through over the last couple of years with the pandemic, and I think many people feeling separated and isolated from their loved ones at the time of death, but to realize that we're never disconnected, even if we can't be at the bedside or be together during the dying process, for whatever reason, we have to be separated. We are still always connected, and we can always, in a sense, participate in the love that we share together and in that process as it's happening. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. It's so affirming about the connection, the love, sometimes we hear this term, it's so beautiful over there. And when they talk about beauty, it's a physical beauty, because they talk about the environment being so awe-inspiring, but it's a deeper beauty. It's the beauty of existence. It's the beauty of being. It's the beauty of creation. And it's so heartwarming. So yes, these experiences deliver that.
And I know, William, as a doctor myself, I know that medicine has been very slow to embrace these types of experiences, to even recognize them or give credence to them, which I think is what causes so many people to not tell their stories, because they might have tried and found that they weren't believed. But I'm wondering what you're seeing, having written the book and with the research you're doing. is that changing? Do you see more acceptance on the horizon?
Yes. So we have a journal article on the shared death experience. It is the first one that is research-based and peer-reviewed, and the American Journal for Hospice and Palliative Medicine has released that in December, and it's the end of November right now, but it is now, it's published. And I will say that I was very pleased, as was our research team, Dr. Michael Kinsella, our chief of research, and Dr. Monica Williams, our medical director. Their comments from the reviewers were very thoughtful. And in all three, the reviewers were very sure to thank us for doing this research, because as one reviewer said, we all know these experiences take place. Those of us who are in the field know of them, hear of them. We just have never been able to really study them the way that the Shared Crossing Research Initiative has. So this is a huge foundational article, and the goal is that it will serve as a foundational piece that end-of-life practitioners across the field can take and share with their colleagues and share with, their medical directors and their hospices and, wherever, and say, these experiences are real. We need to integrate this knowledge into our care programs. This needs to be a part of how we work with our patients and their families, because these are experiences that are had by caregivers, loved ones, and of course, the healthcare providers themselves. So are we seeing changes? I think there's a lot of openness. I think COVID in general has opened up our culture worldwide to death and dying, to ask more questions. And I think the shared death experience is there being gradually part of the dialogue increasingly. I can tell you I'm getting more and more inquiries, but of course that has a lot to do with the number of publications we have coming out. So I hope so. I mean, I didn't answer your question directly. Is there more openness, more receptivity? I say yes in my town of Santa Barbara, which is small and progressive. I'm hoping that continues. I mean, I think like I said, the publication, certainly my book and now the academic research, of which there's more coming out. We also have another article that's been approved but not yet published by Omega, Journal of Death Studies. So we're doing the best we can, but I'll tell you, it's word of mouth. And for your listeners, which I know are active in the field and professionals and very forward thinking, it'd be wonderful. I'd encourage everyone to talk more about it. Just talk more about it, because I think we'll find that it's far more common than we thought.
Oh, I think you're so right. And we really need to create a safe space where people who are having these experiences have someone to talk to and are not afraid anymore to speak up and ask questions about it. And we could do so much in hospice and palliative care if we just said, sometimes people have experiences that seem out of the ordinary, and that's okay. It happens fairly frequently. I think if all we did was say that, I think it would help people so much to be able to come forward and able to tell us their stories.
Yeah, you said that so well. I mean, really well. That's what I would want all of us as end-of-life practitioners to hold this. We don't have to know. So much about our healthcare system is based on, and it's great. It's wonderful. We have a great healthcare system in this way, is that everything has to be kind of figured out and validated in all this research, and in a certain sense, understood more the biological mechanisms that are taking place in our human body. Well, what is true about the shared death experience and so many end-of-life phenomena, quite frankly, is that they happen in an unseen world. We can't know what these mechanisms are in a way that satisfies our scholarly methods. But what we can do is honor the experiences because we know people have them and we know they're meaningful. And these are happening in healthy minds and in healthy people and people who are not expecting them. So, and they're not hallucinations. They're just not. And so we just need to say these are happening and they're meaningful. We need to support people, and we don't need to know the why of it all. I think we need to be humble and say, wow, there's a lot we don't understand about the mystery and beauty, the majesty of the human experience. And the shared death experience falls in that category. A beautiful experience offers so much healing to the experiencer. And we don't need to know how it happens. I mean, we're trying to study it. Maybe we'll get there, but it's tough. This is a real mysterious experience.
Yeah, and in so many ways, it seems like it sets people apart a little bit, well, from their previous selves. It seems like people kind of find themselves changed into a new person and may set them apart from their friends and family members a little bit. But the more we talk about it and the more we share about it, we may find that many more of us have this in common, and we actually have had experiences, like you say, that come from the mysterious, that don't have an explanation. And so I'm really excited by the work you're doing and that you're bringing it all out into the light and you're sharing the stories. And that's going to go so far in helping other people to talk about it and tell their stories. And that makes me want to ask you, if someone listening has a story, is there a way where do they go to share it? I mean, who can they tell about their story?
Thank you. I would invite anybody who has had a shared death experience or an experience, even a pre-death vision or a post-death vision or visitation, even synchronicities we're interested in and around death. And I'll add another one, pre-death premonitions. We consider all of these experiences as shared crossings. These are shared crossings being, in the medical community, we call these end-of-life phenomena. We just tend to call them shared crossings, but they're the same thing. This idea of this communication from this human dimension somehow into what lies beyond, across the veil or whatever language. There's this kind of knowledge that seems to be inspired or communicated from afar, not from our own human experience. And we track all of these, we're doing a big piece on we call it the shared crossing spectrum of end-of-life experiences. And that's the article we just finished for Omega, Journal of Death Studies. But we continue to do this because we really want to paint a picture that is a map, a real user-friendly map of the beautiful landscape at the end of life and after death, because we believe it's all connected. So yes, if your listeners have these stories, shared death experiences, or the other ones identified, please send them to go to sharedcrossing.com, and you'll see you can also write us at info@sharedcrossing.com. And there's lots of resources on our website too. So if you're saying, well, I'm not really sure what a shared crossing is or what William's inviting us to share, you can go there and see the definitions we have, and you'll find it quite informative. Also, one other aspect that's important is that we have we started a story library, and that is a library where people who've had their experiences, they come from our research, and we Zoom video all of our interviews. So we have these Zoom videos, and we've edited them down to 3 to 5 minutes, really getting the key points. And then we put them up on our story library for people to hear experiencers talk about their experience. And it's, they're snippets, if you will, of people's stories, but they're quite helpful in getting the sense for SDEs. Wow. And that's not published just yet, I should say. It's going to be in the next week or so. But it should be ready by middle of December.
That's fantastic. And that's about when this interview is going to air. So when
Great.
People are listening to it, you should be able to go on the website then, the sharedcrossing.com, website, and I'll leave a link to that in the show notes for this episode too, so people can get there quickly and easily. And then I wanted to remind everyone about your book, At Heaven's Door, What Shared Journeys to the Afterlife Teach About Dying Well and Living Better. And tell us when it's going to be published and where people will be able to buy it, or they can actually buy it now. Is that correct? Pre-order?
Yes, it will be published on January 11th, and pre-orders are welcome now. And I thank you in advance for your interest. I would say, you can go to our website and find different places. I say buy it at whatever bookseller you feel comfortable with, but also talk to your local bookseller as well, because we found that when the local, at least in my town, the local booksellers theirs provide such a great service. We like to support them, and you can find your local bookseller by just going to when you go to if you go onto our website, you can get a link, and it will give you the option to go to the indie booksellers in your area. So all you do is click on it, and it will show you the independent booksellers nearby. Like I said, that's just a suggestion. We're just happy that people will be interested enough to purchase it and share it with their friends.
And I wanted to mention that the book is just full of stories, fascinating stories that you will love reading. So it's not like it's a research article. It's narrative. It's really lovely, and the stories are really heartwarming and inspiring. So it's something anyone, I think, would enjoy reading. And I also think it would make a good book for a book club, perhaps, to read together and have a discussion about it, because it's good to open people up and get us all sharing our own stories of what we've seen and experienced. So I'd like to recommend that too. That I don't know if you'll come up with any kind of reader's guide for the book, but that could be helpful too for people in a book club to just have a reader's guide that would lead them through the book.
Oh, well, that is a great idea. Boy, I will add that to my list. But you're right. That would be wonderful. Wow. Okay, so Aaron, thank you.
Of many things you're doing as you get this book out there in the world.
Well, the other thing I would say is if people do have a book club and, there's, certain, if it's a larger book club, I would be happy to, I say that now, I don't know my schedule is going to be after the book, but I would like to think that for people who are leading book clubs, especially for, people who are, really interested in the topic and want to ask deeper questions, like, in other words, they feel like the book has scratched the surface for them for certain things. I would love to think that I could, join a book club for some period of time and just to take some questions or write them to me, and I'll respond, something like that. So I also want to hear feedback from people about it. And you can do that, provide feedback, on any of whether it's an Amazon platform or any other bookseller platform, because I'll be looking at those too to see what people's responses are. And then you can follow. We just got started on social media. Well, we've been on Facebook for a while, but we're also on Instagram, and I often respond to questions through those venues as well. And we have a newsletter as well to keep people up to speed on things we're doing. And I know you have a lot of end-of-life practitioners. So I just want to mention that there will be more programs. We used to be an in-person only with a series of our different programs, preparation for, we used to call it the pathways, a preparation for a conscious, connected, and loving end-of-life experience. And then we teach people the protocols we've learned to enable the shared death experience and other shared crossings. But we're bringing those online in the wintertime of 2022, as well as we're going to start a shared crossing practitioner certification program, which is designed to be a complement for anybody who wants to bring the wisdom of shared crossings and SDEs in particular into their practice in whatever form, whether you're a doula, a midwife, a hospice worker, a nurse, doctor, also mental health practitioners, spiritual care providers. So we're created this as a supplement to other trainings. It won't be like, there's so many wonderful, doula trainings out there and and nursing programs. This would be supplemental, focusing really on shared crossings, how to recognize them, how to understand them, and most importantly, how to work with them in practice clinically so that you can help people integrate them into their lives and help them process them so that they can harvest the gifts, as Karen said earlier, the gifts. People, you'll see that in the book, people call these experiences gifts to them. And so how do you open this gift? And we have methods to do that.
And that's fantastic. And trainings like that are really the way that we make sure we're creating enough safe spaces so everyone can tell their story and share it and really reap the benefits of it instead of maybe wondering if they're crazy or having to hide their experience from other people. They can bring it out in the open and spread the word about it. So it sounds like listeners should just need to go to the website, sacredcrossing.com, and they could sign up for your newsletter maybe and stay informed of what's coming up in the future.
Yeah, that'd be Shared Crossing. Sacred Crossing is a colleague of ours, Olivia Barham, who's wonderful.
Right.
She's down in Los Angeles and runs great programs as well. Ours is sharedcrossing.com.
Shared Crossing. Yeah, sorry.
No, I think that's great. Olivia is wonderful. So.
Well, you can go to both of those websites.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sharedcrossing.com to learn about these trainings we've just been talking about and to get a link and pre-order the book. And well, William, I'm just so excited about what you're doing. And wow, what a 5 years you've had since we last talked, that all this has come together. And I'm just so excited about how you're moving forward into the world.
Well, thank you, Karen. You've, you had me on your show, like you said, 5 years ago, and you being a medical doctor, have that unique receptivity to these experiences. So both the real solid medical training and then the other pieces that come from being just a really wonderful human being, realizing that there's so much more going on. So honoring these spiritual experiences. I just thank you for allowing me to share this with your listeners.
Well, you're so welcome, and we'll stay in touch and maybe talk sooner than 5 years the next time.
I am sure of that. So,
all right. Thanks again.
Thank you, Karen.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with William Peters. One thing that I really liked hearing about are the benefits for people who have shared death experiences, particularly that they sense that their loved one is alive and well in a benevolent afterlife. That's very sweet to me and really touches my heart. Also, that it helps people with the fear of death and helps them with their grief and helps them have a new understanding of life. That is very powerful to me. And all the teaching in the world that I could possibly do, all the talking I could possibly do, could not teach someone or give someone that information that they could receive in an instant through a shared death experience. So it's really powerful, and I'm really excited to be learning more about it. Also, I like the idea that they're offering some online instruction in the future. I think it's really important for all of us who work with people at the end of life to become informed about shared death experiences so that we can be of assistance with patients and their loved ones who might be experiencing some of these mysterious and more mystical phenomena at the end of life. So remember, I'll be back next week with another new interview for you. And if you enjoy the things that I put out there in the world, be sure to tell someone else about it or share episodes with someone who might benefit from this work. And also be sure to subscribe or follow the podcast wherever you happen to be listening. And if you're so inclined, leave a review and a rating, because that's very helpful to the podcast and helps us grow the audience of people who are interested in end-of-life issues. You can also help out the podcast by going to my page at Patreon, Patreon, patreon.com/EOLU, and signing up to join our team. If you'd like to leave a small monthly contribution, just as little as $2 a month, you can help me defray the costs of producing and broadcasting this podcast. You can also help us get a little closer to our goal of being able to generate transcripts for every podcast. We need 20 more supporters on Patreon in order to reach that goal. So until we're together again next week, remember, we're here for love. That's really the only thing that matters. So face your fear, be ready for whatever life brings your way, and love each and every moment of your very precious life. Bye-bye.